Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Car Guy. My name is Klaus Kinder. I'm your host this morning. I'd like to welcome Bill Seimer to our show today. How are you, Bill?
Hey, I'm good, Klaus. Good to be here.
Thank you. I love that you're here. I met you about 10 years ago, and I was working at the Porsche dealership at the time.
That's right.
And we had a common interest in cars, I think.
I think we did, and you convinced me to bring out an early 911 when you were doing an introduction of the newest 911 model at that point, and you brought a friend of yours, Tony Adamowicz, along with you.
I did. Tony was a
Yeah,
great guy, and gosh darn it, it was great that I was super glad that you got to meet him. Tony was a world-renowned race car driver, and you actually gave him one of your cars to drive.
I did. I had him drive my 1969 911S in the at the Spokane Festival of Speed. He was our celebrity driver, and what a great guy! It was like having your best friend driving your car.
Yeah.
You know, he hung out in the car trailer. There was no pretense. He was just easy to get along with, and Klaus, that's kind of how I find people in this hobby. Or even in the business of racing or in cars, if they're truly an enthusiast, they tend to be pretty cool people that you like to spend time with.
It's true. I think it's the only sport that I've ever been involved in where everybody will help everybody until you get on the racetrack,
Yeah, pretty much.
and then that's pretty much over.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a great hobby, and I still thank you for letting Tony drive your car. I think that was just awesome.
Well, that was the coolest thing, and actually just spend the weekend with him. And if you think back to when I first met him at the dealership for that launch of the new 911, I don't know if you recall, but he was signing, autographing things for people, and I kind of stayed back because I'd read a little bit about his history, and I asked him a specific question about a specific race, and he talked till about 2 in the morning. I remember, people were asleep on the desks. That spouses generally, of both genders who were not really into it, and those of us who were into it were having a great conversation with Tony, and I'll never forget that night. It was just incredible.
Yeah, he was a terrific guy and a good friend.
Yeah,
You are a just recently retired CPA.
a recovering CPA, we'd like
Recovered.
to say.
I've never heard of that.
It's true.
And one of the best known and probably most respected CPAs in all of Spokane, perhaps all of Washington, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, a few people know me, but that's very kind of you to say.
Yeah, I've heard good things, nothing but good things. So, what got you into cars?
Well, I grew up around it, Klaus. My dad was a mechanic and had his own little shop by Gonzaga Prep, Ace Auto Repair. And as a kid, I would be down there after school playing. I mean, I got a workbench, I had tools. I could take things apart. I could make things. He had a pile of, vehicles outside that were parked, behind the shop that I could go take parts off of. And what a great place for a kid just to go, in a safe environment, go kind of learn how to, play with cars and learn about them. And I learned not to hold on to the spark plug wire on a motorcycle when your buddy kicks over the starter. That was one of my early lessons.
That's a very quick learning experience.
Yeah, very
isn't
quick
it?
learning experience. I had a go-kart that I would take across Nevada and run around Gonzaga Prep's parking lot and for hours at a time. And when I got to be a little bit older, about, probably about 10, a little bit older, my dad would pull me in and I'd be doing a brake job on one of his customers' cars. Probably violating child labor laws as they may have existed at that time, although it was a long time ago. So it was a great experience, and I took that, and sadly, he died in an accident at work when I was 11,
Oh, no.
and I inherited his tools, which he brought home, and I started to work on things at home and repair people's lawnmowers and do those types of things. But I always thought of it, I'd prefer to have that be a hobby than be what I do for an occupation, because it frankly makes it more fun.
I wish I had that mechanical aptitude. I don't. I put things together, and there's always spare parts left over. So,
Well, that's normal, Klaus. There should be some spare parts left over. They say if you were building enough carburetors, after a while, you'll have enough parts to build a new one.
oh yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, since we share this affliction for Porsches, I'm not sure if it's an affliction or an addiction, one of the two. What was your first Porsche?
My first Porsche was a 72 914. Neat little car, 1.7 liter, pretty stock, and yet it was a lot of fun. You would not be surprised, I modified it a little bit.
No.
It became a 1.8 pretty quickly and had a little more performance to it. And stupidly, I sold it because I needed money for a down payment on my first house. My wife and I were kind of bursting at the seams in an apartment or a rental house and saying, no, we need to have our own place. And so I sold it for the down payment, and it was totaled about a week later.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And so that began, really my practice of not selling them, buying them, keeping them. And I've sold a couple since, and I regret doing that.
I've seen some of the cars that you have, and you have a propensity for hoarding a few.
I do. I'm just worried.
Which I appreciate.
Yeah,
I really,
I
really,
sell
do.
them. What's
Because
gonna
I get to live
happen?
vicariously through your collection.
Well,
which
it's all
is neat.
fun. And, you spread it out over, and it seems rather extravagant, but you spread it out over a number of years. It's not really a big thing.
Yeah.
You buy one, you restore it. A few years later, you buy another one, you restore it. When 40 years have gone by, you've got a couple of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a favorite? Do you have a favorite
That's
car?
a tough question because I like different cars for different reasons. My little 57 Speedster, it is so much fun to drive. It's like I call it the little boat, like the Barchetta for Ferraris. You feel like you're in a little boat, and on a nice summer day or early fall day when it's cool, there's nothing better than driving that car around. I never put the top up on it because you really can't see out of it if you do. But in those conditions, that's certainly my favorite car. But I have other favorites, depending on what I'm doing and what
But do you think that one's it? Do you think the Speedster's probably it? If you had a choice and you're going to go somewhere one day, do you think that one's it?
I kind of think of it a different way, Klaus. I think what would be the last car I would sell from my collection?
Okay.
And that's the last car.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I've got the 62 Lotus 23 that is the most amazing little car on the racetrack. So it would probably be my second to the last car that I would sell. It's just a little scooter, and you just have fun with it. And it's a real period piece. In the day, they were really, really sought after. A lot of famous people drove them. And my best story is when I drove out here in the Spokane Festival of Speed. The year I first bought it, I put it on the pole. I was running with the Formula Ford group with a closed wheel car. And I pull into my trailer, and none other than George Fulmer, who had driven a 23 with a Porsche engine in it,
Really?
had raced one with a Porsche engine, was waiting in my paddock to get me out of my car and congratulate me for putting the car on the pole. And I'm pinching myself thinking, George Fulmer, Can-Am world champion for Porsche driving the 917, and he's congratulating me. But I mean, that's the effect that little car has. People look at it with a lot of nostalgia, and even now at the races, people come up and say, whatever you do, don't quit driving that car. Don't lock it away in a museum or put it in your garage and never bring it out because it's so cool to see it out here.
And that happens to a lot of race cars.
It does.
A lot of the cars have become so bloody valuable.
Yeah.
That it's almost impossible to put them on a racetrack and take the risk of having that car damaged or written off. Right.
And so what happens today is certainly on an international level, at the highest levels, you'll see people will have, let's say, a Ford GT, and they will build a replica of that, a very precise replica of that car, and they'll keep the real one in their collection, and they'll race the clone, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
sense.
You understand why they do it.
Sure.
Unfortunately, they sometimes increase the performance where it's somewhat ridiculous, but beyond that, I totally get it. And you mentioned my '69 911S that Tony got to drive. When I first started racing, that was the first car I raced. And
that was actually my next question.
That was it. And I would be on track, and I would in Seattle, and I'd look over in turn one, and there would be a '57 Ferrari Testarossa. And believe me, I gave him a lot of room because even then the car was worth a lot of money. But what's that car worth today?
It's $20 million.
$20 million. Do you think
Nick Mason, the drummer for Pink Floyd, goes out there and drives his 250 GTO. That's probably a $45 to $50 million car. It's hard to fathom that.
It is hard to fathom that,
right?
Isn't it?
It's just an enormous amount of money. But
and I guess you can rebuild anything if you damage it, but mostly. But it's ideal if you don't do that.
Yeah.
So I understand why people have put them away. And it was just the time, 25 years ago, even though that was a valuable car, the guy that owned it said, I can bring it out and enjoy it.
It's funny. I was sitting in a backyard years ago in Southern California. A guy by the name of Dick Marconi who owned Herbalife. We get together on Saturday afternoons and kind of hang out at Dick's house. And I was sitting with this guy who happened to be sitting next to me, telling me the story of that he used to own the 250 GTO bread van.
No
And
way.
he sold that car in 1967 for $12,500 and thought he had hit a home run
And hates himself now.
with a passion.
It hurts. It does hurt.
Have you always vintage raced, or did you do some modern racing before you got into vintage, or?
Vintage racing was always where I wanted to go because I love how it captures the period that it does. And I know as time has gone on, they've allowed newer cars in because they have to.
I think the romance is gone. From the years gone by. That you and I remember as a kid being a Jimmy Clark fan and a Graham Hill fan and a
Yeah.
Fangio fan, and there was romance. And even when you went to racetracks, you could get close to the cars and the mechanics and the drivers. And you can't do that anymore
And
today.
vintage racing tries to recreate that
Yeah.
to some degree, and to some degree they succeed.
Yeah.
Some marquee events do an incredible job of it. Think of the Goodwood reunion. I mean, that is just an amazing thing.
And we're going to talk about that reunion
Oh, cool.
because
Cool.
I understand you are now a member of the Goodwood.
Well, I'm still a member in waiting, so I'm
A member
I'm
in
a
waiting.
member of the
I love the
fellowship.
English. A member in waiting.
Member in
yes.
waiting. But they did invite me to participate in the members meeting, and so they did allow me to go on there to at least theoretically go on the racetrack with their members, and they weren't willing to accelerate my membership. There's only so many members, and so you don't get in unless someone gets out, and but you have this member in waiting thing, so member of the fellowship, and so I'm in the queue, as they would say, waiting to come up and do
I
that.
would think there's probably some pretty important race car drivers that belong to that club.
There are, yeah, there are.
Well, name a few.
Well, Sir Jackie Stewart was one that when I was there in 19 and driving demonstration laps in the reunion that they invited me to do, and Sir Jackie led the group. It was primarily Brian Redmond, certainly. Dario Franchetti he was there a few weeks ago. He is obviously very comfortable in that space, hanging out with his friends.
It's odd, Frankidian being a Scotsman, right?
Yeah, that's right. And he had these little driving shoes on with Indianapolis 500, the little wings and that.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, and so yeah, it is a storied group. That's of course the track where it is a safe track. It's fairly flat. There's not a lot of runoff, so if you do go off, you hit these tire walls that are filled with dirt. But that's the track where Bruce McLaren lost his life.
Right.
So as I drive around, I think about that, and he had the early days of aerodynamics and a equipment failure, and but for me as an amateur, it seems like a very, very safe place. But I'm not going that quickly either.
Yeah. Amazing. So you have a rather interesting opportunity coming up to drive a rather special car, Sam. Where is it? Can we get it on the big screen, or is that one over there? The Xerox Special. Talk to me about that car and the history of that car and who drove that car and how important it was, because it's cool.
How
It's
controversial
way cool.
it was, I think, is what we think of. So a good friend of mine owns that car, and it's based on a 1961 Cooper T53 Formula One car. And
And I understand you got to meet Cooper's daughter.
I did.
Looking at this car,
So I was at the reunion in 2019, and this gal walks up, pleasant gal, and says, "Do you own this car?" I said, "No, a good friend of mine does." And she goes, "Well, I'm Sally Cooper, and my dad designed this car." And she had her grandson, so the great grandson of John Cooper. We got him in the car, got some pictures, and
how cool.
she was just so pleasant. She said, "I haven't seen it since I was a girl. It's great to see this car again." But it was controversial. Roger Penske was probably stretching, or finding every little benefit within the rule book that he could exploit, which is okay. It's what you do. And he did it rather well. He put a body on that car, made it into a two-seater. There's a little jump seat.
Oh, is there?
Over to the right of the driver, you lift up a little panel, and there's truly a seat there. I don't think any human could actually fit in it, but I don't think that was a requirement. And a good friend of mine who lives in Maple Valley was a good friend of Pete Lovely's. And Pete Lovely reached out to him at some point and said, "I know some of the mechanics who were with Texas Rosebud Racing in the day, and they've got some interesting parts left over." Because, race cars get
Really?
used, abused, damaged, reassembled, reframed, and this mechanic would just collect bits. We had a bunch of bits from the Xerox Special, all the suspension bits. It had a very bent-up frame that had been damaged. And at that point, it had been widened because Bruce McLaren bought the car from Roger Penske and widened the car and put a V8 in it and made it into a Can-Am car. And that car still exists today.
Really?
So the version of the Xerox Special that my friend owns is really a restoration or recreation, some people would say, with original bits of the original format of that car. So it's got the original type of engine and gearbox and all of that, and it's a Coventry Climax type engine. It's not the V8 that is in the Can-Am version of the car. It's a wonderful torquey 2.5 liter engine. Just performs really, really well. It's a fun car. I'm told that chassis was driven in the T53 form, the chassis that my friend has, by Pedro Rodriguez.
Really? That I did not know.
My friend had to buy another chassis because the one he had been widened. So if he was going to restore or recreate the original version of the car, he found another Lotus T53 chassis. And he's nice enough to let me drive it. The day it came out, when he had just finally completed his construction of the car, brought it to the racetrack, he gets a text message from the personal secretary to the Duke of Richmond, who owns the Goodwood facility. And they said, "We want your car here," the very day it came out.
What an honor.
And so over the next few months, they were able to get FIA papers in the car, have it inspected to prove its provenance. And then he was able to take it back to Goodwood at 19, drive it there all season. I went back for the reunion and was able to invite her to drive the car in demonstration laps. Cooper was the featured mark that year. And then I was invited back again just a few weeks ago to drive the car in the members meeting. And darn it, I couldn't because I got a breakthrough case of COVID in England. So I had to be in my hotel room quarantining the day that the race ran. But I did get to practice on track in the car. And I've driven it at Pacific Raceways in the rain. And it's an amazing little car to drive.
What a great experience.
And I hope I have another chance to go back, a second bite at that apple.
I got a feeling you probably will.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, I got a feeling. You have a favorite race car driver?
Oh, no, I don't.
Really?
Again, I like different people for different reasons. I mean, you think of Fangio. I mean, what an amazing guy. And
Yeah.
and in his time, the cars required someone big like he was to muscle them around. Jim Clark.
That's when the tires were skinny and the drivers were fat.
Exactly. I mean, Jim Clark, when you look at the things he did, just amazing. And
Yeah.
and I do tend to like the older drivers. People have been around this sport for a while. Again, it's the nostalgia and history of it that I really enjoy.
Yeah, the Innes Irelands and the Sterling Mosses and
Yeah.
the Jimmy Clarks and the
Yeah.
Graham Hills, and I get all of that. I really truly do. I think it was a different. In fact, I know it was a different era in motorsport, and it was more dangerous than it is today. And it took a certain amount of courage, I think, back in the day, to climb into one of these things.
Yeah, it would.
We lost a lot of drivers in the 60s and 70s.
Well, you think of the post-war period where a lot of that generation, the greatest generation, they showed no fear for this.
Yeah.
Really for anything.
Yeah.
They would just go out and do these things.
And they didn't get paid for it.
And they didn't get paid at all well for it. I mean,
It astonished me when I found out that Tony hardly ever got paid at all. I mean, he was a factory Porsche driver pretty much. He drove for Dan Gurney.
Yeah.
He was the only American driver to drive a 917 in Europe. Drove a Ferrari 512P at Le Mans and finished second. And to think that you would do that for virtually
Nothing.
right? Just the chance to get in.
Right.
Okay.
Just
I'm
being
all
in the
in.
game.
I'm all in.
Well, George Fulmer, when I met George, he'd moved up to this area, and he was driving a school bus in post-fall. So here you have this guy who was a Can-Am world champion driving a 917. He's driving a school bus. It's because, there was not much money in it.
No.
There were not pensions for those guys.
No.
Nothing like there is today. And so I have a lot of admiration for them, a lot of respect. I read a lot about that period, about drivers. Archie Scott Brown, I don't know if you've read about him, a British driver. He was a thalidomide baby, and so he had really only one whole arm. The other arm was stunted, and he was able to race listers and race well. Sadly,
that was not an easy car to
Not an
drive.
easy car to drive.
Tony drove in '73 for Carl. I think he was sponsored by Carlton Beer, and he drove a Lola, if I'm not mistaken, and for most of the season with a broken hand. And that is a car that, with being healthy, is difficult to drive.
Would be very difficult to drive.
Very difficult to
Yeah.
drive. And yet he pulled it off somehow with one-handed.
So,
He's an
you
amazing.
read about these people, and in a few cases where we know them, you just come away with this huge respect. So that's kind of the period I'm stuck in. Not a bad thing.
No, it's a very, very cool thing. I'm really, really glad you came today. Well, the thing that has always astonished me about Spokane is how many great cars there are here and people that own them, and yet we never get to see them, or rarely do we get to see them. I've been astonished by a couple of the cars. You know what I do for a living, and some
Yeah.
of the people that call me up and say, "Well, I have a Cobra," and and the first thing I think is if you've got some plastic kit car, and all of a sudden I show them it's in a real bloody thing. Another gentleman called me up 3-4 years ago, said I have a Facel Vega. I said, in Spokane? Right? And it's amazing the amount of cars here. There are some really, really great collectible cars, and again, the people that own them as well, but we rarely get to see them, unfortunately.
I call it the car next door because they're out there, and I'll see it. You do too. You're driving around your neighborhood, a garage door is open, and you spy something in there.
Yeah.
And if there's someone there, I usually go talk to them. And not only is the car really special, but the story behind it's
Yes.
incredible.
Yes.
Like the guy in my neighborhood who has a pre-war car that his parents bought new. They've kept, and when they finally passed, the boys were all sitting around the table deciding who wanted it, and he was the youngest, and he was sure it was going to get away from him. And all of his older brothers passed on it, and now it's in his garage, and he takes it out and drives it and enjoys it, and and you hear about his stories about going with his family on family vacations in that car
Yeah.
and doing things, and the stories behind it are almost
I agree.
maybe as special.
Yeah,
as
I
the cars
agree.
themselves.
I buy and sell vintage cars for a living, which and sometimes the stories are even more interesting than the automobile themselves.
Yep.
It's just really kind of a fun deal. I'm really glad you came today. I'm really glad we got to spend some time. Hopefully our viewers will get some idea of just the wonderful people that we have here in this city who have great cars and enjoy this wonderful hobby.
Well, it's been fun to be here, and hopefully we'll have a chance to chat again.
What I'd like to do is maybe take a look at one or two of your cars and,
Yeah, we
and
could probably do
maybe
that.
give our viewers an opportunity to share those as well. It'd be kind of fun.
Cool.
Excellent. Thanks for being here, Bill.
Gladly.